The first sign something was wrong came disguised as praise, the kind that lands too loudly in a quiet room. "You're a lifesaver," my manager said during the Monday stand-up, smiling at me the way people smile when they want witnesses. I'd been at the company for 8 months, long enough to understand the rhythms, short enough to still believe effort mattered. We were a regional services firm with a polished reputation and thin margins, the kind of place that sold reliability as a product. I ran operations across 3 teams, translating sales promises to delivery schedules, smoothing frictions before they reached clients. I liked the work because it had consequences. If I messed up, trucks rolled late, people got angry, contracts wobbled. That morning, the praise felt off. It came after a missed service level target that had nothing to do with my team, a target I'd flagged weeks earlier as unrealistic after sales changed scope without telling anyone. I documented the risk, escalated it verbally, and moved on. Now my name was being attached to the miss, wrapped in compliments like a bow on a brick. My immediate reaction was confusion, followed by a tightness behind my eyes that I tried to ignore. Meetings ended, people scattered. My manager asked me to stay behind. He closed the door gently, sat across from me, and spoke in the calm, disappointed tone reserved for children and subordinates. He said the executive team was concerned about patterns. He said optics mattered. He said I should own the narrative because leadership meant accountability. I nodded because nodding had kept me employed my whole life. Inside, a reel of emails and conversations played back in precise detail, each one contradicting what he was implying without saying. I left his office with a vague action item to tighten controls, which in practice meant absorbing blame without authority. Over the next 2 weeks, it escalated in small, deniable steps. My project updates were rephrased before they reached the directors. Decisions we'd agreed on privately were reframed as my unilateral calls. When a client complained about a delay caused by a vendor he personally approved, he forwarded the complaint to me with a single line, "Please address." I addressed it because that's what I did, but the address never reached the client. It was logged as a failure on my scorecard. Coworkers started acting careful around me, the way people do when they sense a story forming and don't know which side they'll need later. The injustice wasn't a single act, it was a system assembling itself around me. The emotional hit came late one night when I was rereading my calendar to make sure I wasn't imagining things. There it was, a meeting I'd been excluded from, scheduled during a time I was usually free, titled with my project name. My manager had presented my work without me, and the next morning he'd corrected me publicly on a decision made in that meeting. I felt a hollowing sensation, like something essential had been scooped out and replaced with air. Anger came after, sharp and focused, followed by fear. I had a mortgage. I had savings, but not enough for a long unemployment. I had a reputation I'd built carefully, and I could see it being eroded by implication, not evidence. I considered confronting him directly. I drafted sentences in my head that were calm, professional, irrefutable. Each version ended the same way, with him smiling, apologizing for a miscommunication, and continuing exactly as before, only more careful. The decisive event happened on a Friday afternoon. He asked me to join a call with a partner who'd been unhappy for months. On the call, he listened sympathetically as the partner described failures that traced back to sales overpromising and leadership approving exceptions without capacity. When it was my turn, before I could speak, my manager said, "We've identified an internal process gap and we're correcting it." He looked at me on the video feed, eyes steady. The partner nodded, relieved to have a culprit. I felt heat rush up my neck. I corrected the record gently, sticking to facts, but the damage was done. After the call, my manager messaged me privately, "Let's align before you jump in next time." That was the moment the last illusion broke. I sat alone at my desk as the office emptied, listening to the HVAC cycle on and off, feeling the weight of a truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about mistakes, it was about control. He was protecting himself by distributing consequences downward, and I was the most visible surface to absorb them. My immediate thought was to leave, to cut losses, to find a place where honesty wasn't a liability. Then another thought followed, quieter but heavier. If I left now, the story would be sealed with my silence. I would carry it with me, and he would refine the method on someone else. I realized, with a clarity that felt almost calm, that there was no fixing this by being better or clearer or more accommodating. The only way out was through, and the only language he respected was consequence. I shut down my computer, picked up my bag, and as I walked to the elevator, the desire for revenge didn't feel like rage, it felt like inevitability. I didn't sleep much that weekend, not because I was plotting anything dramatic, but because my mind kept trying to negotiate its way out of reality. Maybe I was misreading him. Maybe this was just how pressure traveled in organizations like ours. Maybe if I documented better, communicated more, stayed later, it would stabilize. Every rationalization sounded thinner than the last. By Sunday afternoon, the fear arrived fully formed. Not abstract anxiety, but practical fear, being edged out slowly, performance managed without a single provable lie, left with a reputation I couldn't defend because nothing explicit had ever been said. I realized that if I was going to act, I couldn't act emotionally. Anger would make me visible. I needed to understand the system he was using before I touched it. So I did what I'd always done best. I observed. On Monday, I stopped volunteering context in meetings. I answered questions directly, narrowly, and waited. The effect was immediate. Silence made people uncomfortable. Gaps appeared where my explanations used to be. My manager filled them, and in doing so, he started contradicting himself. Small things at first, dates that didn't line up, commitments he attributed to me that I hadn't made. I began keeping a private log, not of documents or files, just timestamps and verbatim phrases written at the end of each day while they were still fresh. I told myself it was for my own sanity, but part of me knew it was more than that. The internal conflict came from the risk. I wasn't breaking rules, but I was changing posture, and in a place like this, posture was everything. There were days I nearly abandoned the idea altogether, especially when a director praised my responsiveness or when a teammate asked for advice like nothing was wrong. Those moments hurt more than the confrontations. They reminded me what I stood to lose if this went badly. The motivation returned every time my manager reframed a problem he'd caused and let it drift in my direction without naming me. He never pushed directly, he let implication do the work. My first small risk was subtle. During a cross-functional meeting, he summarized an issue and said, "We'll fix this in ops." I waited a beat and then asked, evenly, "Which parts specifically do you want my team to change?" The room went quiet. It was a fair question, but it forced precision. He hesitated, then gave an answer that conflicted with an email he'd sent earlier that week. No one called it out, but I saw a few eyebrows lift. After the meeting, he stopped by my desk, all casual concern. "Everything okay?" he asked. I smiled and said yes. Inside, my pulse was racing. I'd tested a boundary, and he'd noticed. That night, doubt crept in hard. What if I was escalating too soon? What if this provoked him into accelerating the exit he was already engineering? I imagined HR conversations I wasn't part of, narratives solidifying without me. The fear wasn't paralyzing, but it was constant, like background noise. The next step wasn't about confrontation, it was about visibility. I started routing updates through shared forums instead of private messages, not defensively, just transparently. I asked clarifying questions in writing when decisions affected delivery. Each time I worried it would look political. Each time I reminded myself that ambiguity was the weapon being used against me. The complication came from an unexpected place, a colleague named Sarah, someone I trusted and had mentored. She pulled me aside after a meeting and said, carefully, "You should be cautious. He's frustrated." The way she said it told me more than the words. Frustrated with me, not the problems. I asked what she'd heard. She shook her head and said she didn't want to be in the middle. I understood. That's how systems like this protected themselves, by turning bystanders into risk managers. Her warning rattled me. It meant my changes were registering, and registration was dangerous. I considered backing off, returning to my old role, letting the slow bleed continue until I found another job. Then a setback hit that removed the option. At the end of the month, my performance dashboard showed a red indicator tied to a metric I didn't own. I emailed to correct it. The response came from my manager. Let's discuss offline. Offline meant undocumented. I replied, politely, asking to understand the criteria. He didn't answer. The indicator stayed. That night, sitting at my kitchen table, I felt the familiar urge to capitulate, to accept the unfairness as the cost of stability. Instead, something hardened. I realized the plan couldn't be about exposing him directly. It had to be about letting the structure reveal itself without my fingerprints on it. The small success came the following week. A partner escalated an issue, and the executive team scheduled a review. I prepared my usual materials, then added a single slide outlining decision dependencies. Nothing accusatory, just sequence and ownership. During the review, my manager tried to redirect responsibility, as he always did. The slide made it awkward. Not explosive, just awkward. The room shifted from blame to process. No one defended me explicitly, but no one blamed me either. Afterward, a director thanked me for the clarity. It wasn't victory, it was worse for him and better for me in equal measure. As I rode the elevator down that evening, I knew I'd crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. The system had noticed, and it would respond. Pressure has a way of changing the texture of time. Days stretched longer, meetings felt denser, and every interaction carried an aftertaste of implication. After the review, my manager stopped treating me like a liability he could quietly redistribute and started treating me like a variable he needed to control. He looped me into fewer decisions, then blamed delivery gaps on my lack of alignment. He praised me in writing for diligence while questioning my judgment verbally. The duality was exhausting, and it forced a decision I'd been postponing, either retreat into self-protection or accept the risk of escalation. I chose escalation, not because I wanted to win, but because stasis had become a slow form of loss. The bolder actions weren't dramatic, they were structural. I requested a formal clarification of roles for a project that crossed sales, finance, and operations, framing it as a risk mitigation exercise. The document circulated higher than I expected. My manager approved it with edits that subtly shifted accountability back toward me. I hesitated before responding. The moral dilemma wasn't about truth, it was about timing. If I corrected him publicly, I'd look defensive. If I accepted it, I'd reinforce the trap. I chose a third option and asked a neutral question in the thread about how success would be measured given the shared ownership. It forced a response from finance that contradicted his edits. The thread went quiet. A director replied later with a revised version that balanced responsibility. I felt a flicker of satisfaction followed immediately by dread. Each move reduced my room to maneuver. The unexpected consequence arrived the next day when HR requested a check-in. The invite was framed as routine. The questions were not. They asked about stress, collaboration, perception. I answered honestly but carefully, describing processes, not people. Walking back to my desk, my hands were shaking. I knew what this was, the prelude to a narrative capture. Either I would be defined as difficult, or I would force clarity that made difficulty visible elsewhere. Around this time, I learned something that reframed everything. Sarah asked me to grab coffee off-site. She looked tired, and when she spoke, it came out in a rush. She'd been asked to provide feedback on me, not formally but informally, which was worse. She'd been told leadership was concerned about my tone and alignment. She said she hadn't agreed, but she hadn't contradicted it either. I didn't blame her. I thanked her for telling me. On the walk back, anger finally surfaced. Not hot, but heavy. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a pattern of pressure that turned decent people into buffers. The plan adjusted itself in my head. I stopped thinking about defense and started thinking about exposure, not of a person, but of a method. I began requesting pre-reads for meetings and circulating summaries afterward that captured decisions verbatim, not interpretations, just words. The effect was immediate. My manager started declining meetings or sending deputies. When he did attend, he spoke less and interrupted more. The psychological pressure ramped up. Sleep became fragmented. I replayed conversations looking for missteps. I worried about crossing an invisible line into something I wouldn't recognize myself doing. The biggest twist came when a senior partner reached out directly, bypassing my manager. He asked for a candid view of delivery risk on a deal that had been pushed through aggressively. I knew my manager had championed it. I also knew the risks were real. The moral dilemma was stark. If I softened the truth, I'd protect my position and perpetuate the damage. If I spoke plainly, I'd be contradicting leadership and inviting retaliation. I chose precision. I outlined the risks with evidence, timelines, and dependencies without naming anyone. The partner thanked me and said he'd adjust expectations. 2 days later, my manager confronted me in his office. The door closed harder than usual. He accused me of undermining him. He said trust was broken. I listened, heart pounding, and replied that my responsibility was to deliver integrity. He smiled then, thinly, and said we'd discuss next steps. That night, I stared at my ceiling and considered walking away. The stakes were higher than I'd planned. I was risking not just my job, but my professional identity. The turning point arrived the following week during a leadership offsite. I wasn't invited, but my projects were on the agenda. A director asked me to join remotely for a segment. I logged in to see a slide attributed to me that contained projections I hadn't made. My name was on it. I felt a surge of panic followed by clarity. This was the move I'd been anticipating. I asked, calmly, where the numbers came from. My manager answered confidently, citing assumptions I knew were false. I shared my screen and pulled up the original model with timestamps and notes. The room shifted. Questions followed. My manager tried to recover, but the discrepancy was undeniable. The call ended abruptly. Within an hour, HR messaged me to stand by. Everything was at risk now. The line between self-preservation and open conflict had dissolved, and there was no version of this where I could step back unnoticed. The days that followed blurred into a sustained hum of adrenaline, the kind that sharpens perception while eroding patience. HR's message sat unanswered for an hour while I forced myself to think, not react. I knew that whatever came next would be framed as procedure, but procedure could be weaponized as easily as silence. When I finally joined the call, there were 3 faces instead of 1, and the tone was measured, sympathetic, and relentless. They asked me to explain the discrepancy from the offsite. I did, carefully, walking through sequence rather than motive. I could feel my manager's absence like a pressure in the room. He wasn't there to interrupt, which meant he was working another angle. The call ended with promises of follow-up and a reminder to keep discussions confidential. I hung up and felt a wave of nausea. The plan, such as it was, had entered a phase where outcomes would no longer be incremental. That afternoon, my manager sent a calendar invite titled Alignment. It included HR and a director. The invite time overlapped with a client review he knew I was scheduled to lead. It was a choice disguised as logistics. I declined the overlap and proposed an alternative, copying the group. Minutes later, the invite was rescheduled. Small victories had become leverage points. The emotional tension spiked as allies became variables. Sarah stopped by my desk, eyes darting. She said she'd been asked again for feedback, and this time it was formal. She looked guilty and afraid. I told her to tell the truth. After she left, I wondered if I had just sacrificed the last buffer between me and isolation. The critical decision came that evening as I reviewed my log, the one I'd told myself was for sanity. Patterns crystallized into something undeniable, a sequence of approvals, reframings, and omissions that consistently redirected accountability downward. I realized that the climax wouldn't be a confrontation, it would be a demonstration. The next day, I sent a concise note proposing a cross-functional risk review for the next quarter, attaching a neutral framework that required each function to sign off on assumptions. It was innocuous enough to pass initial scrutiny and formal enough to force participation. The review was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. That was the first unexpected reversal. Leadership wanted it now, before narratives hardened. The danger was obvious. If the review ran cleanly, it would surface decisions my manager had relied on being diffuse. If it collapsed, I'd be blamed for the confusion. I barely slept, rehearsing contingencies. The morning of the review, my manager arrived early and took a seat opposite me. He was calm, almost friendly. He said he appreciated my initiative. He said this would clear the air. I wondered which version of the story he believed would survive. As the meeting began, the framework did its work, drawing lines that had been intentionally blurred. Sales hesitated, then acknowledged scope changes. Finance clarified thresholds. Operations commitments were defined precisely. Each signature tightened the system. My manager interjected with strategic vagueness, attempting to reassert flexibility. A director asked for specifics. The room leaned forward. The pressure was immense, and I felt a flicker of doubt. Had I misjudged how much the organization wanted truth over comfort? Then came the second reversal. A senior executive joined late, listened quietly, and asked a single question about how exceptions had been approved historically. The answer, when it came, implicated leadership decisions without naming names. Silence followed, heavy and revealing. My manager tried to redirect, but the moment had shifted. I felt exposed, terrified, and resolute all at once. The review concluded with action items that redistributed accountability upward. No one declared victory, no one apologized. The consequences were procedural, which was the point. As people filed out, HR caught my eye and asked me to stay back. They said there would be an investigation into discrepancies in reporting. They said it neutrally. I nodded. Walking back to my desk, my phone buzzed with a message from my manager. We need to talk. The peak arrived faster than I expected. In his office, he closed the door and dropped the pretense. He said I had forced his hand. He said reputations were fragile. He implied outcomes without stating them. I listened, pulse roaring in my ears, and replied that transparency had a way of redistributing fragility. He smiled again, thinner than ever, and said we'd see. As I left, my email chimed with a calendar invite from HR titled Next Steps, scheduled for the end of the day. I sat down, staring at the screen, knowing the plan had reached its most dangerous edge. Whatever happened next would not be managed quietly. The HR meeting did not start the way I expected. There was no accusation, no raised eyebrow, no thinly veiled threat wrapped in policy language. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that something systemic had been uncovered and that it couldn't be unseen. They told me the investigation had expanded beyond the slide discrepancy to a broader review of decision ownership and reporting accuracy across multiple quarters. They said this as if they were describing a weather pattern, not a collapse. My manager was not present. That absence said more than any reprimand could have. I answered questions for nearly 2 hours, sticking to sequence, not interpretation. When it ended, they thanked me for my cooperation and told me to take the rest of the day. I walked out of the building feeling hollowed out, not triumphant. The adrenaline that had sustained me for months drained away, leaving fatigue in its place. That night, I slept for 12 hours and woke up unsure whether I still had a job. The following week unfolded slowly, deliberately. Meetings were postponed. Decisions stalled. People avoided speculation, but not curiosity. Sarah texted me to say she'd been interviewed and that she'd told the truth. She apologized anyway. I told her she didn't owe me anything. When my manager finally resurfaced, it was in a brief all-hands note announcing he would be transitioning out to pursue other opportunities. No details, no acknowledgement. The organization absorbed it like a shockwave that dissipates without sound. In private conversations, fragments emerged, discrepancies, pressure, a pattern that had become impossible to defend once it was named. The consequences were real but measured. No public reckoning, no dramatic exposure, just a reconfiguration that made the old methods unusable. For me, the fallout was mixed. I was asked to stay to help stabilize operations during the transition. The offer came with validation and with cost. I accepted, knowing that staying meant living in the aftermath of something I'd helped dismantle. Some relationships cooled permanently, others deepened quietly. There were moments of doubt, especially when I wondered if a cleaner exit would have spared me months of stress. But then I remembered the alternative, leaving under a shadow I didn't cast. The final realization came weeks later, during a routine meeting that felt different in a way I couldn't immediately name. People spoke more carefully, not with fear, but with ownership. Questions were answered directly. Accountability had edges again. I realized then that revenge hadn't been about harm. It had been about refusing to carry weight that wasn't mine. The satisfaction wasn't in watching someone fall. It was in standing still while the structure corrected itself. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt older, steadier, and clearer about the cost of silence. The last thought that stayed with me was simple and unromantic. Sometimes justice isn't loud, and revenge isn't fire. Sometimes it's endurance, precision, and the willingness to let the truth be inconvenient long enough to matter.